Hi, guys. The Battle of the Canids. Grandpa Joe, sir, shouted Mr. Wonka, kindly jet yourself over to the far corner of the elevator there and turn that handle. It lowers the rope. A rope's no good, Mr. Wonka. The Canids will bite through a rope in 1 second. It's a steel rope, said Mr. Wonka. It's made of scorched steel. If they try to bite through that, their teeth will splinter like spilikins. To your buttons, Charlie. You've got to help me maneuver. We're going right over the top of the transport capsule, and then we'll try to hook onto it somewhere and get a firm hold. Like a battleship going into action, the great glass elevator with booster rockets firing moved smoothly in over the top of the enormous transport capsule. The Canids immediately stopped attacking the capsule and went for the elevator. Squadron after squadron of giant, vermicious Canids flung themselves furiously against Mr. Wonka's marvelous machine. Wham! Crash! Bang! The noise was thunderous and terrible. The elevator was tossed about in the sky like a leaf, and inside it, Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina, and Grandpa George floated in their nightshirts. Were all yowling and screeching, flapping their arms and calling for help. Mrs. Bucket had wrapped her arms around Mr. Bucket and was clasping him so tightly that one of his shirt buttons punctured his skin. Charlie and Mr. Wonka, as cool as 2 cubes of ice, were up near the ceiling working the booster rocket controls. And Grandpa Joe, shouting war cries and throwing curses at the Canids, was down below turning the handle that unwound the steel rope. At the same time, he was watching the rope through the glass floor of the elevator. "Starboard a bit, Charlie," shouted Grandpa Joe. "We're right on top of her now. Forward a couple yards, Mr. Wonka. I'm trying to get the hook hooked around the stumpy thing sticking out in front of there. Hold it. I've got it. That's it. Forward a little now and see if it holds. More. More." The big steel rope tightened. It held, and now, wonder of wonders, with her booster rockets blazing, the elevator began to tow the huge transport capsule forward and away. "Full speed ahead," shouted Grandpa Joe. "She's gonna hold. She's holding fine." "All boosters firing," cried Mr. Wonka, and the elevator leaped ahead. Still the rope held. Mr. Wonka jetted himself down to Grandpa Joe and shook him warmly by the hand. "Well done, sir," he said. "You did a brilliant job under heavy fire." Charlie looked back at the transport capsule some 30 yards behind them on the end of the tow line. It had little windows up front, and in the windows he could clearly see the flabbergasted faces of Shuckworth, Shanks, and Showler. Charlie waved to them and gave them a thumbs-up signal. They didn't wave back. They simply gaped. They couldn't believe what was happening. Grandpa Joe blew himself upward and hovered beside Charlie, bubbling with excitement. "Charlie, my boy, we've been through a few funny things together lately, but never anything like this. Grandpa, where are the Canids? They've suddenly vanished." Everyone looked around. The only Canid in sight was their old friend with the purple behind, still cruising alongside in its usual place, still glaring into the elevator. "Just a minute," cried Grandma Josephine. "What's that I see over there?" Again they looked, and this time, sure enough, away in the distance in the deep blue sky of outer space, they saw a massive cloud of vermicious Canids, wheeling and circling like a fleet of bombers. "If you think we're out of the woods yet, you're crazy," shouted Grandma Georgina. "I fear no Canids," said Mr. Wonka. "We've got them beaten now." "Poppy rot and pigwash," said Grandma Josephine. Any moment now they'll be at us again. Look at them. They're coming in. They're coming closer." This was true. The huge fleet of Canids had moved in at incredible speed and was now flying level with the great glass elevator. A couple of 100 yards away on the right-hand side. The one with the bump on its rear end was much closer, only 20 yards away, on the same side. "It's changing shape," cried Charlie. "That nearest one. What's it going to do? It's getting longer and longer." It indeed was. The mammoth egg-shaped body was slowly stretching itself out like chewing gum, becoming longer and longer and thinner, until in the end it looked exactly like a long, slimy, green serpent as thick as a thick tree and as long as a football pitch. At the front end were the eyes, big and white with red centers. At the back, a kind of tapering tail. And at the very end of the tail was the enormous, round, swollen bump it had gotten when it crashed against the glass. The people floating inside the elevator watched and waited. Then they saw the long rope-like Knid turning and coming straight but quite slowly towards the great glass elevator. Now it began actually wrapping its ropey body around the elevator itself. Once around it went, then twice around, and very horrifying it was to be inside and to see the soft green body squishing against the outside of the glass no more than a few inches away. "It's tying us up like a parcel," yelled Grandma Josephine. "Bunkum," said Mr. Wonka. "It's going to crush us in its coils," wailed Grandma Georgina. "Never," said Mr. Wonka. Charlie glanced quickly back at the transport capsule. The sheet of white faces of Shuckworth, Shanks, and Showler were pressed against the glass of the little windows, terror-struck, stupefied, stunned, their mouths open, their expressions frozen like fish fingers. Once again, Charlie gave them the thumbs-up signal. Showler acknowledged it with a sticky grin, but that was all. "Uh-oh!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Get that beastly squishy thing away from here." Having curled its body twice around the elevator, the Knid now proceeded to tie a knot with its two ends. A good strong knot, left over right, then right over left. When it pulled the knot tight, there remained about 5 yards of one end hanging loose. This was the end with the eyes on it, but it didn't hang loose for long. It quickly curled itself into the shape of a huge hook, and the hook stuck straight out sideways from the elevator, as though waiting for something else to hook itself onto it. While all this is going on, nobody had noticed what the other Knids were up to. "Mr. Wonka!" cried Charlie. "Look at the others. What are they doing? What indeed?" These, too, had all changed shape and had become longer, but not nearly so long or thin as the first one. Each of them had turned itself into a kind of thick rod, and the rod was curled around at both ends, at the tail end and at the head end, so it made a double-ended hook. And now all the hooks were linking up to one long chain, 1,000 Knids, all joining together and curving around the sky to make a chain of Knids 1/2 a mile long or more. And the Knid at the very front of the chain, whose front hook was not, of course, hooked up to anything, was leading them in a wide circle and sweeping towards the great glass elevator. Here they go. They're going to try and hook onto the elevator and keep it from moving so they can attack. "Hey," shouted Grandpa Joe, "they're going to hook up with this brute who's tied himself around us and tow us away," cried Charlie. "To the planet Vermis," gasped Grandma Josephine, 18,427 million miles from here. "They can't do that," cried Mr. Wonka. "We're doing the towing around here." "They're going to link up, Mr. Wonka," Charlie said. "They really are. Can't we stop them? They're going to tow us away, and they're going to tow the people we're towing away as well." "Do something, you old fool," shrieked Grandma Georgina. "Don't just float about looking at them." "I must admit," said Mr. Wonka, "that for the first time in my life I find myself at a bit of a loss." They all stared in horror through the glass at the long chain of vermicious Knids. The leader of the chain was coming closer and closer. The hook with the two big angry eyes on it was out and ready. In 30 seconds it would link up with the hook of the Knid wrapped around the elevator. "I want to go home," wailed Grandma Josephine. "Why can't we all go home?" "Great thundering tomcats," cried Mr. Wonka. "Home is right. What on earth am I thinking of? Come on, Charlie, quick, re-entry. You take the yellow button, press it for all you're worth. I'll handle this lot." Charlie and Mr. Wonka literally flew to the buttons. "Hold your hats," shouted Mr. Wonka. "Grab your gizzards, we're going down." Rockets started firing out of the elevator from all sides. It tilted and gave a sickening lurch, and then plunged downward into the Earth's atmosphere at a simply colossal speed. "Retro rockets," bellowed Mr. Wonka. "I mustn't forget to fire the retro rockets." He flew over to another series of buttons and started playing on them like a piano. The elevator was now streaking downward head first, upside down, and all the passengers found themselves floating upside down as well. "Help!" screamed Grandma Georgina. "All the blood's going to my head." "Then turn yourself the other way up," said Mr. Wonka. "That's easy enough, isn't it?" Everyone blew and puffed and turned somersaults in the air until at last they were all the right way up. "How's the tow rope holding, Grandpa?" Mr. Wonka called out. "They're still with us, Mr. Wonka, sir. The rope's holding fine." It was an amazing sight. the glass elevator streaking down towards Earth with the huge transport capsule in tow behind. But the long chain of Canids were coming after them, following them down, keeping pace with them easily. And now the hook of the leading Canids in the chain was actually reaching out and grasping for the hook made by the Canid on the elevator. "We're too late," screamed Grandma Georgina. "They're going to link up and haul us back." "I think not," said Mr. Wonka. "Don't you remember what happens when a Canid enters the Earth's atmosphere at high speed? He gets red hot. He burns away in a long, fiery trail. He becomes a shooting Canid. Soon, these dirty beasts will start popping like popcorn." As they streaked on downward, sparks began to fly off the sides of the elevator. The glass glowed pink, then red, then scarlet. Sparks also began to fly on the long chain of the Canids, and the leading Canid in the chain started to shine like a red-hot poker. So did all the others. So did the great slimy brute coiled around the elevator itself. This one, in fact, was trying frantically to uncoil itself and get away, but it was having trouble untying the knot, and in another 10 seconds it began to sizzle. Inside the elevator, they could actually hear it sizzling. It made a noise like bacon frying, and exactly the same sort of thing was happening to the other 1,000 Canids in the chain. The tremendous heat was simply sizzling them up. They were red hot, every one of them. Then suddenly they became white hot, and they gave out a dazzling white light. "They're shooting Canids!" cried Charlie. "What a splendid sight," said Mr. Wonka. "It's better than fireworks." In a few seconds more, the Canids had blown away in a cloud of ashes, and it was all over. "We've done it," cried Mr. Wonka. "They've been roasted to a crisp. They've been frizzled to a fritter. We are saved." "What do you mean, saved?" said Grandma Josephine. "We'll all be fizzled ourselves if this goes on any longer. We'll be barbecued like beefsteaks. Look at that glass. It's hotter than a fizz-gig." "Have no fears, dear lady," answered Mr. Wonka. "My elevator is air-conditioned, ventilated, aerated, and automated in every possible way. We're going to be all right now." "I haven't the faintest idea what's going on," said Mrs. Bucket, making one of her rare speeches, "but whatever it is, I don't like it." "Aren't you enjoying it, Mother?" Charlie asked her. "No," she said, "I'm not, nor is your father." "What a great sight it is," said Mr. Wonka. "Just look at the Earth down there. Charlie, getting bigger and bigger. And us going to meet it at 2,000 miles an hour," groaned Grandma Georgina. "How are you going to slow down, for heaven's sakes? You didn't think of that, did you?" "He's got parachutes," Charlie told her. "I'll bet he's got great big parachutes that open just before we hit." "Parachutes," said Mr. Wonka with contempt. "Parachutes are only for astronauts and sissies. And anyway, we don't want to slow down. We want to speed up. I've told you already, we've got to be going at an absolutely tremendous speed when we hit. Otherwise, we'll never punch our way in through the roof of the chocolate factory." "How about the transport capsule?" Charlie asked anxiously. "We'll be letting them go in a few seconds now," Mr. Wonka answered. "They do have parachutes, 3 of them, to slow them down on the last bit." "How do you know we won't land in the Pacific Ocean?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I don't," said Mr. Wonka, "but we all know how to swim, don't we?" "This man," shouted Grandma Josephine, "is crazy as a crumpet." "He's cracked as a crayfish," cried Grandma Georgina. Down and down it plunged, the great glass elevator. Nearer and nearer came the earth below. Oceans and continents rushed up to meet them, getting bigger every second. "Grandpa Joe, sir, throw out the rope. Let it go," ordered Mr. Wonka. "They'll be all right now, so long as their parachutes are working." "Rope gone," called out Grandpa Joe, and the huge transport capsule, on its own now, began to swing away to one side. Charlie waved to the 3 astronauts in the front window. None of them waved back. They were still sitting there in a kind of shocked daze, gaping at the old ladies and the old men and the small boy floating about in the glass elevator. "It won't be long now," said Mr. Wonka, reaching for a row of tiny pale blue buttons in the corner. "We shall soon know whether we are alive or dead. Keep very quiet, please, for this final bit. I have to concentrate awfully hard. Otherwise, we'll come down in the wrong place." They plunged into a thick bank of cloud, and for 10 seconds they could see nothing. When they came out of the cloud, the transport capsule had disappeared and the earth was very close. And there was only a great speed of land beneath them, with mountains and forests, then fields and trees, then a small town. "There it is," shouted Mr. Wonka, "my chocolate factory, my beloved chocolate factory." "You mean Charlie's chocolate factory?" said Grandpa Joe. "That's right," said Mr. Wonka, addressing Charlie. I'd clean forgotten. I do apologize to you, my dear boy. Of course it's yours. And here we go. Through the glass floor of the elevator, Charlie caught a quick glimpse of the huge red roof and the tall chimneys of the giant factory. They were plunging straight down onto it. Hold your breath, shouted Mr. Wonka. Hold your nose, fasten your seatbelts, and say your prayers. We're going through the roof. Whoa. That is the end of chapter 11. That was exciting, huh? Draw me a picture of what you think is going to happen next or your favorite part of the whole story today. And write me out a little sentence to go with it if you can. I'll see you guys in a bit. And don't forget, wash your hands, please.